Indigenous Rights Radio, because knowledge is power.
You are now listening to Cultural Survival's Global News Bulletin. Every month, Cultural Survival brings you the latest news impacting Indigenous peoples across the globe. This December edition features important stories from Europe, North, Central, South America, Africa, Asia, and beyond. On the global front, UNESCO recently hosted a pivotal two-day forum in Paris, bringing together 44 indigenous media experts from 29 countries to address the challenges and opportunities facing indigenous media worldwide. The forum emphasized the critical role of indigenous media in promoting inclusivity and diversity. It focused on developing concrete strategies to implement the Article 16 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, in short known as UNDRIP. Article 16 of UNDRIP recognizes the rights of indigenous peoples to establish their own media and access all forms of media without discrimination. The forum amplified indigenous voices, calling for global action to strengthen indigenous media and ensure its vital role in shaping a more inclusive and diverse media landscape. Similarly, the UN has a new special rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples. Congratulations to Dr. Albert Barume on his nomination by the Human Rights Council. Dr. Albert Koko Barume is a Congolese lawyer, UN Security Council expert, former chairperson of the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, expert for the African Union on Indigenous Peoples' Rights, and former coordinator and senior specialist for ILO Pro 169 on Indigenous and Tribal Peoples. In Canada, Canadian indigenous groups are pursuing deals with China to gain access to natural resources, despite warning from Canadian security services. The First Nations want to bolster their income through energy deals and other business ventures with China. This has caused tension between Canada's national reconciliation efforts with its First Nation communities and national security priorities. While Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has pledged to promote economic reconciliation with indigenous communities, many still face social and financial challenges. China has noticed this and is attempting to capitalize on these situations. However, Canadian security services are wary of China's motives and potential access to valuable resources. Despite these concerns, First Nations leaders are determined to pursue deals with China, prioritizing the economic benefits for their communities. In New Zealand has taken a groundbreaking step by spearheading the world's first trade agreement for indigenous peoples. The Indigenous Peoples Economic and Trade Cooperations Arrangement, co-chaired by Northland's Pita Tipain, aims to empower indigenous businesses, facilitate trade among indigenous communities, and uphold values like sustainable development. Initiated during New Zealand's hosting of the 2021 Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, Indigenous Peoples Economic and Trade Cooperation Arrangements has garnered support from Canada, Australia, and Taiwan as founding members, with the United States as an observer and interest from other nations. This unique partnership between indigenous peoples and the governments, modeled after New Zealand's Te Tiriti Waitangi framework, recognizes the substantial size of the indigenous economy and promotes ethical business practices. With ongoing virtual meetings and planned in-person gatherings, Indigenous Peoples Economic and Trade Cooperation Arrangements is set to deliver concrete benefits to indigenous communities globally. Now, news from Africa. In Kenya, Kenya's ongoing eviction of the indigenous Ogaik from the Mau forest, whom the government blames for deforestation, have failed to halt forest loss, with 2024 satellite data showing continued significant damage. Despite a 2017 court ruling recognizing the Ogaik as the forest ancestral owners and ordering compensation, action has to be taken. Even after the eviction of over 700 Ogaik people in November 2023, government officials remain skeptical of the deforestation findings, with some attributing damage to local communities instead. In contrast, Daniel Covey, Program Director of Ogaik People's Development Program, which aims to protect indigenous people's rights, suggested eviction was responsible for the losses. Staying in Kenya, President William Ruto surprised attendees at the Ma Cultural Festival in Samburu on Friday, November 9th, by wearing traditional Maasai attire. The festival, which began on November 7th and ran until November 9th at the Samburu National Reserve, celebrated Kenya's indigenous cultures. Ruto emphasized preserving and promoting these cultures for sustainable national development. Other cabinet members from Kenya also attended the event in an effort to foster better relationship between Kenya's indigenous peoples and government officials. In Cameroon, indigenous peoples of Cameroon are mostly hunters and gatherers who have been crossing lightly guarded international borders for food and game for centuries. The Baka and Bageli indigenous communities in Cameroon face increasing challenges due to a lack of birth certificates, which limits access to essential services like education, healthcare, and employment. Many Baka children, such as 11-year-old Francis, struggle to pursue their dreams due to the absence of identifications. The Cameroonian government has recognized this issue, and a recent bill aims to address statelessness by promoting access to nationality documents, but much work remains to help these marginalized communities. Now, news from Asia. In Taiwan, Wakata Maori journalists recently journeyed to Taiwan, finding deep connections between Maori and Taiwan's indigenous communities, united by shared struggles for cultural preservation and self-determination. Like Maori, Taiwan's 16 indigenous tribes face language endangerment, prompting elders like Akawen Pakawen to champion language revitalizations among youth. Similarly, tattoo artist Kurdzwe Padzidres revives traditional tattooing practices, connecting families to their ancestral heritage. These efforts represent a cultural renaissance, resisting assimilations and asserting sovereignty in the face of historical marginalization and ongoing pressure from China. Taiwan's indigenous peoples fight for Tino Ranga Tiratanga mirrors this global struggle of indigenous communities to secure their cultural survival and political autonomy, fostering solidarity and a vision of thriving cultures and self-governance. In the Philippines, a new investigation reveals that the Philippines government's push for mining critical minerals like nickel and copper is jeopardizing indigenous communities and vital ecosystems. 1/5 of the country's landmass is now covered by mining tenements, with a quarter overlapping protected biodiversity areas and indigenous lands. This expansion has resulted in significant land grabs from indigenous communities, equivalent to an area larger than Timor-Leste. The report also highlights the alarming rise in violence against environmental defenders, with the military linked to mass killings and detentions. This green rush for minerals is fueling land grabs, destroying ecosystems, and intensifying militarizations, raising concerns about the human and environmental cost of the energy transition. While the global shift towards renewable energy drives the demand for these minerals, experts warn that this green rush must not compromise human rights and environmental protection. Now, news from Americas. In Nicaragua, on November 18, 2024, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights condemned Nicaragua for violating the rights of indigenous communities about a proposed inter-oceanic canal project. The court found that Nicaragua failed to conduct environmental studies and engage in prior consultation with the affected communities, violating their rights to participate in cultural life, political rights, property rights, judicial guarantees, a healthy environment, and free, prior, and informed consent. This ruling impacts the Rama and Creole indigenous communities of Monkey Point and Black Reole community of Bluefields. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights ordered Nicaragua to pay $1.5 million in compensation for damages and ensure that future actions regarding the canal project include a free, prior, and informed consent process that adheres to international standards. In Chile, indigenous women are at the forefront of battle against climate change, leading grassroots organizations and training initiatives to combat the crisis, facing disproportionate environmental impacts. These women leverage their deep understanding of their surroundings and collective organization to protect their interdependent relationship with nature. Organizations like the National Coordinator of Women of Native Peoples in Chile are empowering these women with the skills and knowledge needed to advocate for change and preserve their way of life. They are leading the charge in highlighting indigenous knowledge as a crucial source of solutions to Chile's environmental changes. In Argentina, in the salt flat of Rincona de Jazz, Jujuy, Argentina, Tecpetrol, an oil company owned by Tequint, faces resistance from indigenous communities over its plans and extract lithiums. The Guantayuc Lagoon targeted for extraction is home to 38 indigenous communities who fear the environmental impact and disruption to their ancestral way of life. On November 15, community representatives voiced their concerns to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, demanding the establishment of mining-free zones. Experts warn that lithium extraction poses significant environmental risks, particularly to water resources, and can exacerbate social divisions with indigenous communities. In Ecuador, thousands of indigenous peoples, led by indigenous nationalities of Ecuador confederations, marched through the streets of Latacunga, Ecuador on Friday to protest against the government's handling of the economic crisis. Protesters cited prolonged power outages lasting up to 14 hours, rising insecurity, and criminal violence as key grievances, blaming the current Ecuadorian president for the nation's woes. Latacunga, located in the provinces of Cotopaxi, has a significant indigenous population and serves as a central hub for the Andean region. This demonstration proceeded in other protests planned by the labor unions in Quito, highlighting the widespread discontent with the government's economic policies. In El Salvador, 25 indigenous women activists from the Nahuatl, Lenca, and Cacahuayra communities have launched the Observatory, an initiative to expose the widespread issue of gender violence within their communities. Over 3 years, they collected data from nearly 600 indigenous women, revealing that over half have suffered some form of abuse. This alarming reality spurred the creation of the Observatory, backed by the National Network of Indigenous Women of El Salvador, UN Women, and Canada Fund for Local Initiatives. The Observatory aims to raise awareness and drive change to protect indigenous women from violence. That is all for this edition of Cultural Survival's Global News Bulletin. Stay tuned for our next podcast. For more information on the rights of indigenous peoples, visit cs.org and follow Cultural Survival on Facebook, Instagram, and X.